Why is front-end development so complicated? I'm a developer, but I haven't worked on a web front-end app for more than 7 years, just before Angular, React, and Vue started to become popular. Back then, we used jQuery and Knockout.js for developing the front end, and it was really easy to pick up and not complicated to develop in. I kind of following the development of the Frontend framework for a while and never really learned them. And from a bystander perspective, it looks unnecessarily complicated. You now have to compile scripting language to a scripting language. There are projects that have hundreds of megabytes of dependencies and compile times of a scripting language that can compare to a big C++ project. Is there a trend that things will become more simple in the future? What do you think? My perspective may be wrong. I mainly do system programming, and in low-level projects, the goals are in the opposite direction. Less code, less dependencies, and more simplicity. That way you can make more stable and fast systems. Edit, thanks for all the comments. I think I got my answer. Front-end tech has been trying to solve a specific problem. The web is stateless, but stateful apps are a better experience and faster, and users are used to apps on their phones. All these frameworks are trying to fix a problem that would be better fixed in the browser. As for the dependencies, it can be a nightmare. One abandoned project and your whole build chain needs refiguring. Never mind different versions of dependencies being needed. IMG Sarshi reddit.static.com/market/svuv-core/emotes/pack sob.gif style vertical align middle. This is my issue. HTML never got the updating it needed, so JS fixed some of it. Then JS got too complicated, so Angular came in to fix the issues with state. Then React came to fix the issues that Angular caused with state and presumably disliking MVC. Repeat that for every JS framework to ever exist. Now you've got a front end and pseudo backend on the client side, and an actual backend, or just an API manager sitting there, and SEO dropped and state management got even worse than what Angular and React fixed. Then Next.js came to say, hey, let's do our program not on the client, but on the server. It'll solve all of our state management issues, and SEO like previously mentioned. Like it was some grand new idea, but that's what the internet was when it was just CSS, HTML, jQuery, Ajax. Not defending jQuery, that was the beginning of this mess, I think. It didn't have SEO issues or slow page load times. These morons took themselves full circle. The root of the problem is that HTML is severely lacking, and they're afraid to do sweeping changes or upgrades to HTML because the entire web foundation is on top of it. You can only do so much with a poor foundation. The only interactive elements HTML has is a and button, and then the form elements it got input, select, text area, and form back in the mid-90s so you could sign up for stuff like buy a plane ticket. After that, you only get more form element pieces like radio or file. No extra capabilities added since the mid-90s, basically. Like, bro, WEF. I guess details and summary elements were the big claim to fame after that. HTML4 was released in 1997, and HTML5 wasn't out until 2014, just stagnating and rotting. I've left out details like Flash and interactivity and app-like experiences and all that jazz, all the regular buzzwords. I tried to boil this down to the root cause, and I think it's largely HTML and browsers not supporting any other scripting language than JS. This is the best answer here. I'm a freelance dev and I've watched things come and go, and I've watched a lot of it come full circle. A lot of solutions looking for problems, IMO. Knowing the latest tech has diminishing returns sometimes. You kind of glossed over how jQuery dominated before and after Angular came out. Although to be fair, it doesn't do much for statefulness. In 2015, jQuery was used on 62.7% of the top 1 million websites, according to BuiltWith, and 17% of all internet websites. In 2017, jQuery was used on 69.2% of the top 1 million websites, according to LibScore. In 2018, jQuery was used on 78% of the top 1 million websites. In 2019, jQuery was used on 80% of the top 1 million websites, according to BuiltWith, and 74.1% of the top 10 million per W3 Techs. As of April 2021, jQuery is used by 77.8% of the top 10 million websites, according to W3 Techs. And actually, it's still heavily used, although not in new modern projects. I'll add that a big part of jQuery was not just the new features it added, but the fact that it worked cross-browser. If anyone has ever had to support older IE versions, they'll know the pain of not being able to use things that are now provided as standard by all browsers. You don't really need jQuery's code doll anymore. Now we have code document.querySelectorAll. But it took a while for that, and other nice things, to become available in all the popular browsers. jQuery not only supported that, but it patched over a lot of differences in browser behavior. In fact, many of these browser APIs, like Code Query Selector ALD, were directly inspired by jQuery. Yeah, probably not the best example because of that. But there used to be very tricky differences in how browsers handled JavaScript. I'm lucky to have been spared most of that. The worst I had to deal with was IE 10.11 and Flexbox differences. Yeah, for sure. When I started in the field, we were still on IE 6, which did not even have DevTools included, and jQuery was absolutely invaluable back then. I don't really like these stats. I'm sure they just look at the root scope of the site to see if $1 is present. If you have a dependency of A, etc. that eventually uses jQuery, would it not just slap it on the root? It's technically used, I guess, but doesn't really feel like something like that should count towards indicating if it's dominating. It was extremely popular in the late 2000s for browser standardization and JS simplification. Doesn't WordPress use jQuery? And WordPress is everywhere. I mean, it's probably part of the reason. Mostly used for, wow, neat. Looks like I'd still have a career if I decide to go back to front-end development, haha. I had extensive experience with it, that it's like second nature to me, lol. As someone who has never done UI development in a desktop or mobile environment, how do these environments compare against HTML? All HTML elements are made up of the aref hps/developer.mozilla.org/us/docs/API element base class. These have attributes and properties, i.e., this element is the base architecture. With UI elements on desktop and mobile, if the application is built with HTML, then it'll be same case. Apart from it, it depends on the language the application is built in. Assuming you mean desktop and mobile that don't use HTML, as many now do, because for as much hate as CSS gets, it's still by far the best approach to responsive layouts. Every desktop or mobile framework I've used has some sort of built-in state management. Many use a model view controller-ish approach, not too different from Angular. Swift UI is similar to React, actually. Next.js part is inaccurate. Around 2014-2016, companies who needed both SSR and heavy client-side interactions were building isomorphic web apps, hand-rolled frameworks that combined wildly complex Webpack configs, Node.js before it was usable, and their preferred frameworks, Ember, Knockout, CoffeeScript, Custom Angular, React. Next.js came about as a solution to replace that cursed era, not general state management. I didn't want to get too long and verbose. Redux is still a thing even with Next.js, so the issues aren't solved with state management at all, but they're much easier. Well said. Though I would argue that it's as much the fault of us still not evolving beyond TCP/IP as it is the fault of HTML. I really like Angular compared to old-school vanilla JS, CSS, HTML, or jQuery because I feel like it brought a lot of much-needed structure to web dev that was sorely lacking. But you're right, there's a new flavor every week, and they just go around in circles/cycles. Sure, we can change TCP/IP. We just need to replace every single device that's connected to the internet. TCP/IP isn't going anywhere. We would have to rebuild the entire internet. It's not possible. Well, of course, you don't just change it overnight. I was never suggesting something like that. It would need to be a dual system, whereby you roll out the new protocol in parallel with existing new devices that can take advantage do so. Otherwise, it fails over to legacy TCP/IP. It's 55 years old and was never intended or designed to do what it does today. It's long overdue to be replaced. It's not possible. Nonsense. Human history is chock full of such examples. People used to navigate by the stars until they invented the compass. People used to navigate by compass until they invented GPS and built it into every mobile phone. But you don't immediately throw out the old just because the new is better. Example, I know how to navigate by the stars, by compass, and using my phone. I don't use the former two if I'm trying to find a Burger King, but I sure as hell would if I was lost in the woods and my battery was dead. There wasn't total stagnation between 1997 and 2014. The W3C wasted nearly a decade trying to get everyone to switch from HTML to XML. But with no way to actually force everyone to change, they had no way to make everyone switch to the stricter XML syntax and redo all of their websites in XHTML. Add in Internet Explorer never having the ability to serve an XHTML document as XML, and we had a situation where XHTML had all of the negatives and none of the positives of XML, so it's not surprising it never caught on. Eventually, the WADWG was able to get the W3C to give up on their dream of XML and return to just making an updated version of HTML. Sure, HTML5 is better than what we had in 4, but just imagine what we could have had if we did all in with XML. Or if the W3C spent that decade working on a new language that had a chance of being accepted and was actually backwards compatible with current sites, unlike HTML2. I agree. Images stick to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Everything else is just smoke and mirrors. For backend, it'll use Spring Boot. No need to complicate things. This is a pretty shitty attitude to have. Like it or not, front-end development has wholeheartedly embraced frameworks, and you're not going to get a job by refusing to adapt. If you like job stability, knowing the tools that actually make up websites is your best option. So many new frameworks rise and fall, and chasing after them tells me you're more interested in shallow marketing appeal than you are in long-term stability and maintainability. I'm actually most interested in being employable. It's not shallow marketing appeal when jobs literally require you to know frameworks. Besides, you can have a strong foundational knowledge and know frameworks as well. They aren't mutually exclusive. TBH, there's a ton of work, which is still doing server-side rendering first and last. Most of the projects that aren't SSR probably should be. The number of people who actually need the power of modern SPA frameworks is about the same as the number of people who actually need K8s for web-scale processing. It'll adapt for job, but I'm talking in context of learning and personal projects. It's not smoke and mirrors, different tools for different jobs. You should know both approaches to be a good web dev 2024 plus. When you say state, I hear performance worries. Performance concerns have leaked, flooded into the frameworks. It's now our problem to manage reactivity. The business rules and logic of an app gets lost in all the signals, observables, use effects, SSR, and so on. However, most of these performance concerns don't matter for 99% of us developers. I have a large AngularJS project, which I'm lazily avoiding upgrading. AngularJS does lots of dirty checking to see what changed, essentially brute forcing the state issue. Sounds terrible, right? But speed is simply not a problem on this app with a couple hundred components/pages, and reactivity is mostly not my problem. I just update state in event handlers, and Angular will laboriously find them. There are frameworks out there that don't clutter your code with performance concerns. If you value readability and simplicity, Svelte, Vue, Solid are good choices. Do not start a new project in AngularJS. Lol, this is so true. Let's render all our front-end JS code on the server and then send it back to the browser. And then we can do hydration when something changes and have extra caches and new problems. Great, SEO fixed, or just like use PHP and render HTML. This is completely it. Great explanation. How come HTML is the weak link? I never thought of it like that. I have used all of the technologies you've mentioned and I still don't see it, but I would like to. So now is Next.js the thing? Last time I heard and see, so many projects, both small and corporate, use React. No, Svelte Kit is the next thing, lol, or maybe Solid. Next.js is just React, Node, and Express all wrapped together. I was thinking the exact same thing when I first learnt Next.js. Next.js feels like early WordPress, where SQL queries were coded into the views. All these frameworks are trying to fix a problem that would be better fixed in the browser. Adobe Flash enters the chat. Java applets will also be joining the chat just as soon as the JVM plugin starts up. Front-end tech has been trying to solve a specific problem. The web is stateless, but stateful apps are a better experience and faster, and users are used to apps on their phones. All these frameworks are trying to fix a problem that would be better fixed in the browser. I don't think that's the biggest problem with web dev. I would say that the biggest problem is that everything we have now was built on top of languages and technologies invented in the 90s, and we can't throw them away because they always want complete retrocompatibility with everything. So, HTML is a mess, CSS is a mess, JS is a mess, and we can never fix that mess because we don't want to break old unmaintained websites that no one ever visits. The web is stateless, but stateful apps are a better experience. That isn't quite the problem front-end frameworks are trying to solve. Cookies fixed the web protocol's inherent statelessness 30 years ago. Yes, people want an app-like experience, but the problem modern JS frameworks are trying to solve is that fast requests are asynchronous. The problem modern JS frameworks are trying to solve is that fast requests are asynchronous. Essentially, frameworks acknowledge that stateful apps are a better experience and facilitate the implementation of those. Ultimately, it all comes back to the web being something completely different to what it is designed for, and a complete lack of belief the standards process can fix it. I actually think it isn't true today. MS probably won't try to sabotage making the web suck less today. However, we are now deep down the pattern of trying to make a system designed for document presentation work as a UI. The web is stateless. Is there any reason why that can't be fixed in its core? In the end, if using front-end frameworks allow to bypass it, it should be able to implement it in the core of the web browsing technology. Very well said. I think the dependency issue is the same for any mature language, though. NPM is just more upfront about it. Projects got as complex as big C++ projects because the products got as complex as big C++ projects. To put it simply, front-end web development stopped being websites. For that, people use WordPress or Squarespace or whatever, and started just becoming front-end development. Application development. Front-end web frameworks are no more convoluted or varied or new and fancy compared to desktop development. Go look at Qt or Google which C++ front-end framework is best and read a long list. Hell, I was a Windows app developer before dev in C#, and it was less stable than web. React had been the default commercial for longer than WPF I worked on back then existed. The task got more complex, so the tooling did too. Though developers have a tendency to overcomplicate the simple problems because they want the experience or to work with the more interesting tools. Sad to see the best answer buried way at the bottom, but everything you said is true. The perception people have of web development is so far removed from reality. They'll see CMS-generated websites and think that's what all professional web developers do. The truth is, professional web development is mostly phasing out desktop applications and replicating their complicated business processes and interactions. Of course, you need a robust framework and standard to do that. Imagine people complaining about using Spring or .NET in the backend when you could just code it in vanilla Java C#. Obviously, there is a lot more going on than meets the eye. Exactly all these old heads talking about how simple it used to be. I wish they would share the UIs they were building back then. I bet they are what second-year comp science students are expected to produce in a semester today. can definitely testify to this. The current project I get to work in could be a desktop app, and it's supposed to consolidate data from various sources and generate data assets for different media and channels, basically bringing 4 separate platforms into one mega platform for planning and scheduling. Supposed to serve a group of 1,000+ users, all with different rights to data and clearance levels when it comes to functionality. The web is becoming the platform. Its use case is being stretched to different levels. Of course, the tooling would become more complex. And now, with Electron.js and whatever else, we can even use web technologies to actually build desktop applications with mature, well-developed front ends, because it is actually easier than doing the same in most other languages, and because a lot of companies want desktop apps over web apps. Please note, this response is neither entirely serious or entirely tongue-in-cheek. Good point about websites versus enterprise web apps. That's definitely true. Hell, I was a Windows app developer before dev in C#, and it was less stable than web. Gonna mention that my few hobby Android apps made me realize what it's like having your best practices, update schedule, and tooling being dictated to you by Google was like. It was a nightmare trying to understand what I was and wasn't meant to do, and that seemed to change every 6 months. Maybe I was just there at a particularly awkward moment, but at least with web dev, there's no single party who can pull the rug out from under you. Chromium is popular, but Google hasn't yet got the power to unilaterally change how things work. This was my immediate thought. The web is just another UI toolkit, but it's one we expect to be able to do a whole lot more than most UI toolkits out there. It's been decades since you've been able to write the sort of spaghetti that OP seems to regard as normal in desktop UI toolkits, because everyone knew it produced an unmaintainable mess. And guess what? Websites written with HTML, CSS, and bare JS plus jQuery tend to also be an unmaintainable mess. Tools for breaking software down into components have been the norm in most of the software development world for all of my life. The fact there are people still kicking and screaming about it in web work is an indictment of the sector. Yeah, look at Figma. Try making that with HTML and jQuery. To put it simply, front-end web development stopped being websites. For that, people use WordPress or Squarespace or whatever, and started just becoming front-end development. Application development. The line between application and website is very subtle, as there's this trend of building static websites as they were web apps. Don't ask me why, as it's out of my comprehension. Front-end web frameworks are no more convoluted or varied, or new and fancy compared to desktop development. Not sure about this, especially if we're talking about JS frameworks. If that's the case, I'm sorry, but no existing JS framework can compare with enterprise-tier frameworks available for other languages as PHP, Python, Elm, Haskell, OCaml, and so on. The task got more complex, so the tooling did too. Not sure about this either. Most web is about social platforms, static, e-commerce is static, blogs static, marketplaces static. To be totally fair is more people wanting to use SPA for everything, thinking it was a good idea, while forgetting how HTTP and the whole web ecosystem works, and then reinventing the wheel to solve a problem we didn't have in the first place. It's a weird coincidence that most dev tooling come with subscription plans and a more or less subtle attempt to lock you into a vendor platform, Vercel, AWS, etc. Though developers have a tendency to overcomplicate the simple problems because they want the experience or to work with the more interesting tools. True, to some extent. On the other hand, developers who work in team can hardly choose the technology stack they want to work with. I would say it's more about how good you're at advertising your next cutting-edge technology more than anything else. Best. There's this trend of building static websites as they were web apps. It's easier. If you have the knowledge of a framework, like Vue for example, and you're going to make a site that has buttons, movement, etc., sometimes it's easier to just use what you're familiar with than busting out the vanilla JS. The DX writing button v-click do something is so much nicer than writing JS to find the element on the page, attach a listener, and handle your code. Now imagine you need a conditional hide. VIF or VShow is a lot nicer to write than yet another selector, CSS accessor, and setting display none or visibility. You absolutely can write it in plain JS, and you should know how to. But there's a lot of simplicity in using frameworks. It's easier. If you have the knowledge of a framework, like Vue for example, and you're going to make a site that has buttons, movement, etc., sometimes it's easier to just use what you're familiar with than busting out the vanilla JS. But you don't have to build it as a SPA, nor to reinvent the wheel. If you need mostly a static website, you can use OCaml, Haskell, PHP, Python. Literally anything but JS would be a better and safer choice. Using JS forces you into the BFF pattern, which is unnecessary overhead and forces you into proxying requests to your own servers. It makes no sense unless you've your whole stack on JS, but that's a different story. You absolutely can write it in plain JS, and you should know how to. But there's a lot of simplicity in using frameworks. That was not the point. I was just saying you don't need JS at all to do most of this stuff, nor using it is highly convenient unless under very specific circumstances. Best. This is the only correct answer. It's kind of funny. I work in a React team, and we have some jQuery legacy code from 7 years ago, and we all hate to work on it. I find structured components much more pleasing to work with compared to a giant file with random functions. I work in a React team, and we have some jQuery legacy code from 7 years ago. I can tell you, since I was there, that wrangling a large, complex, rich application via jQuery modules and shit was a nightmare. These front-end frameworks didn't appear in a vacuum. They were built to solve a problem. jQuery was a fantastic tool to help you not have to always write vanilla JS for everything. That said, I'm very glad that better frameworks now exist. In my career, I've gone from vanilla JS plus HTML4 all of the way to the present tools. It's pretty insane how far things have come, but how far they still have yet to go. jQuery was a fantastic tool to help you not have to always write vanilla JS for everything. And let add here that there are things that were easy to do with jQuery that are still not easy to do with vanilla JS to this day. By easy, I don't mean that I don't know how to do that, but that there are things that you can do with a short one-liner in jQuery, but you need multiple lines and a for loop in vanilla JS. Do you remember the arguments about whether you should use jQuery versus vanilla JS, and how meaningless that all seems years later? By easy, I don't mean that I don't know how to do that. And it was readable. That's the thing that always stumped me about the jQuery naysayers. Despite not relying on jQuery anymore, it was such an important part of understanding JavaScript for me that I've had new hires just build out POC stuff strictly using it. jQuery was a fantastic tool the way Flash was a fantastic tool. It smoothed over the browser discrepancies and made development so much faster. JavaScript is a lot more mature than it was when jQuery dropped. Right now, to me, it's mostly just cruft. I do wish there was a built-in shorthand for document.query selector. Might be one of my favorite parts about jQuery, lol. Obviously, you can write shortcuts to mimic this, but it's just odd to me that it's not standard. A giant file with random functions. I'd never work with jQuery again, as it doesn't make a lot of sense nowadays to me. But to be fair to jQuery, this just looks like badly written and badly structured code. jQuery can be written in a modular way that makes sense, and it's decent to read and maintain. But, of course, it's far easier to write a big file with random functions until you need to actually maintain that. After I started messing around with Angular, I changed how I was writing our jQuery to mimic writing in that style, and it made our lives so much easier. Now I'm working on transitioning our office to React, and a lot of the code that we're going to bother converting anyway is much easier to convert because of that. Well, badly written code is never pleasant to work with. I was not praising jQuery, I was just giving it as a context, as a more simpler times. And I don't see relationship with structured components and modern framework. You can do it without a framework, right? Right? Correct. You can use web components these days, although the developer experience is still better with React. So while the technologies you use might be simpler if you eschew build steps and frameworks, the DX and resulting code will almost certainly not be. I hate writing anything in pure JavaScript for frontend. It gets messy and can't manage the code in a short time. React is best general, even for desktop applications. But do you really have to do it using all of that? This is the problem. You don't need to use a compiler. You don't need to use someone else's framework. All you're doing is using someone else's logic. Frontend is only difficult if you don't understand it at a core level. HTML is the box, CSS styles the box, JS manipulates the box, your DB stores the box. Box, paint, tools, and a garage. That's all a stack needs to be. We just break them down into smaller boxes so we can find stuff easier. Yeah. And people still use them. Why? Allow me to answer this by highlighting one thing the guy you're replying to said. Frontend is only difficult if you don't understand it at a core level. Classic elitist answer you can find in this subreddit. Try to build a complex, collaborative web app without using any framework today, and you'll find yourself reinventing the wheel and finding custom solutions to problems we already have frameworks and libraries for. I'm 100% sure your team will be X10 less productive and will deliver a X10 inferior product, just because you think you're too clever and your system is better than all the proven frameworks we have today. And of course, I'm talking about complex web apps. If you're only building simple informational sites, I guess I can understand why you have that mindset. I read it totally the opposite. I thought it was in favor of frameworks. Like, once you build something without it, you see what the purpose of them and related libraries are, and you can understand the benefits. If that was the case, I totally misinterpreted it. Just came in to answer the exact same thing to that guy. Exactly my thoughts. I guess I misunderstood. I guess he also misunderstood my question. One of your questions was, why is frontend so complicated? He perfectly understood this and answered it by explaining that it isn't so complicated in all cases, but only in cases where front-end devs aren't very good at what they're doing. Man, you guys are totally misunderstanding this poor guy and then downvoting him into oblivion. What the commenter above said is exactly what the OP said, that front-end stuff doesn't have to be so complicated. The problem is, most companies are making it very complicated with modern frameworks, and he wanted to know why. One of your questions was, why is front-end so complicated? I have only one question, and that was not it. This is the title. Maybe it's not worded in the best way, but the title can't fit the whole context of the question. I have only one question, and that was not it. Allow myself to remind yourself of your own topic title. Nobody knows the exact contents of your head. We can only go on what words you actually use. Wherein you posed at least two questions, the one in the title and the one at the top of your final paragraph. Okay, English is not my native language, and I guess I don't always pick the best word. Maybe a better title is, Will the complexity of web frameworks go away? But I got a lot of responses that understood my question. Maybe the issue is not my writing. Will the complexity of web frameworks go away? Probably not, but they're not that complex. I would even say they're easier to use than most back-end frameworks, since they're much smaller. A smart person once said, front-end is only difficult if you don't understand it at a core level. You should hear that smart person. But what is your question? I don't know why you're getting downvoted because the point of your post was perfectly obvious to me and this guy's answer was silly nonsense. Why is front-end so complicated? Just don't use modern frameworks like Vue or React. All you're doing is using someone else's logic. I am very smart because I program everything from scratch in vanilla JS without frameworks or build tools. Here is a ham-fisted analogy about boxes and a garage. What? Yeah, vanilla HTML, CSS, and JS is great. If your project is simple enough, by all means avoid the bloat. I made my web portfolio without any JS frameworks or libraries except for Gulp. But in what real-life situation outside of small hobby projects are you going to be able to say, no thanks, I'll just write this complicated web app you want without any of the tools you're already using in your stack? This advice reeks of someone with no actual professional experience. Oh God, I just checked their profile. It's worse. They're super experienced and they're the type of dev who's out there encouraging people to write their own frameworks because I can accomplish the same thing Laravel can in fewer files and less LOC. You're just using someone else's logic line. Why is that a bad thing? Makes sense now. The ego of the experienced dev, lol. Does your homebrew framework have the same level of support and documentation as a popular framework like Laravel? Does anybody but you really know the ins and outs of it? Is fewer files or less LOC really a valid measurement of anything in this context? Is it really worth the time it would take you to build your own framework when there are endless well-tested options already available? I've worked on homebrew frameworks before, and they fucking suck. I'm guessing his are no exception. This guy I also refl/www.reddit.webdev comments/19A6D7K5P Utin core source share mediums web 2x sounds like an insufferable prick. User void state gave a much better answer, IMO. First, you quoted me wrong and added statements to make it seem like I'm strong that guy. Secondly, OP has a particular problem where front end is in this weird position because as /u void state said, it can be a nightmare, though having an understanding on why a framework is a nightmare is really important. I'm happy you can view a profile and get who I am as a person. I answered his question honestly, just like I answered honestly in the posts you pointed out. Also, that resume was hot garbage and bloated. I'm not one to coat sugar on it. I've never applied for a job and had it rejected by an automated system. Was my first comment needed? Nah. But the number of answers that were just wrong at the time was astounding. Now to answer your questions. Does your homebrew framework have the same level of support and documentation? It can. My proprietary does. And did I even mention that here? Web developers are meant to solve problems. That's what frameworks do. Front-end frameworks make me giggle because it's genuinely back-end minds trying to solve a front-end problem with a language that's limited. Is fewer files or less LOC a valid measurement? Not since 2010. Hardware is much faster, and it honestly doesn't matter. Is it really worth the time it would take you to build your own framework when there are endless well-tested options available? Yes. Making your own proprietary code allows you to maintain your logic. It allows you to not have to be reliant on someone else for updates, meaning your security is much stronger because the market isn't flooded with people who understand the logic you're using. If you've worked on homebrew, lol, that's what they all start as, frameworks and say they suck, to me that sounds like a problem you might be experienced to fix. All in all, if you code following certain principles, you can make a framework quickly that is easily scaled, and it's worth the time to learn what it is that these frameworks do, so you can rewrite them because you feel that they are a nightmare, when in reality, they can be broken down and refactored into something much easier. Because they increase your productivity and developer experience. I can imagine that if you've never worked with all these tools before, then it can be overwhelming, but try and get a TypeScript developer to go back to plain JS, and you will be met with some pretty strong resistance. The compile step is really not that arduous. And as for bundling, that's pretty much a necessary step these days. 8 years ago, there just wasn't much JavaScript on the page. We were building websites with limited interactivity. Now we're building web apps where interaction is everywhere. It's just very, very hard to do in single-file style JS. Organization into components is the best we have right now, and that pretty much means that you need a build step. Why does interactivity need to be everywhere? Do most web applications really need it all? I think your follow-up question is valid. Back then we used jQuery and Knockout.js. Yes, they solved a problem. Can you name the problem, how they solved it, and an alternative solution? I followed the development of front-end framework for a while and never really learned them. That's because a framework was at one point vanilla, but they made it do something to solve a problem. Ask again, what problem did the framework solve? How did they solve it? How can you make an alternative solution? They're objects that have hundreds of megabytes of dependencies and compile times that can compare to a big C++ project. They solve a problem. In this case, this problem is time. Your code is actually more advanced and is technically a wrapper for code that we no longer use because of how well our systems can process memory. Binary, assembly, C came before your favorite framework. Is there a trend that things will become more simple in the future? What do you think? No. Frameworks themselves are wrapped around already strong prove-wrong code bases, as I said above. They do not get less complicated at a technical level. They fix problems. Less code, less dependencies, and more simplicity. Bud, this is exactly why people are saying you don't understand it at a core level. My answers are redundant. Hey, a code principle. I answered your question. It's actually as simple as I stated. Your frameworks are smaller boxes of a garage that have been working for 20+ years. Make your own if you feel like it is becoming a problem. The trade-off is your time, but if you think you can, you can. I understand your point now. I guess I was focused more on the bad examples of web projects. Edit, I never said I have deep understanding how browser technologies work. Because the requirements are complicated, and there is a disconnect. What takes a designer a few minutes to whip up in Figma can be multiple hours of work to implement. Unlike other industries, designers are not required to have any actual experience in web development, so they fundamentally do not understand the medium they are designing for. Or, to be fair, they have to deal with product managers foisting them with these requirements, and they are just trying to make it all fit together. So we have an arms race of ever more complex tools to deal with ever more complex requirements. Now, the real question is whether we need such complex requirements in the first place, but that question is above my pay grade. You describe incompetent designers and managers barking into other people's business. FE has never been easier. Modern web browsers finally agree, mostly, in the specs and even support modules. No compiler needed. You can write beautiful modern JavaScript without any of the old cruft we used to have to do. Many people favor frameworks as they offer a structured approach and a clear methodology. In a corporate environment, frameworks are particularly helpful. They aid developers in comprehending how the application should function. For instance, a React developer from another team can quickly familiarize themselves with our app, as it adheres to standard React practices. As someone who has been coding since the 90s and doing front-end since HTML was a thing people said, I gotta say, I do tire somewhat of people complaining about how difficult it is to write front-end code. Cross-browser support was so much more painful than writing in React. So was having an app where you had to keep your DOM in sync with your state directly. People act like there was some golden age where it was just HTML, CSS, and vanilla JS, and you could build these beautiful, robust applications, but that's just not true. Do people think engineers invented prototype JS, jQuery, Backbone, handlebars, etc., because things were so simple and easy and they were just idiots who didn't appreciate it? These new technologies enable so much. We're able to make beautiful interactive web applications now without resorting to junk like Flash or Java applets. If you just want to make a website, then yes, do what you can do, avoid JavaScript. My personal portfolio is pure HTML and CSS and has a 100 score on page speed. But if you're building an application, why are you complaining that you need to, build it like an application? I think it's also important to note that you can develop static websites at breakneck speed. The things you can do with just CSS right now are amazing. I set up a Markdown-based blog for myself using GitHub Pages and Jekyll with a custom domain in under 10 minutes. From a user perspective, it is indistinguishable from a WordPress site with the comments disabled. But users absolutely demand more. They expect pages to get fresh data without a reload. They expect to be able to interact with it intuitively. They expect them to look like apps, work like apps, while also remaining website with links to bookmark and share. Yeah, it's complicated than it was in 2005 because the products we are building are so much more complicated. I very much agree. I think part of the problem is also the expectation that web development can be thoroughly learned in months. I've even met people that only have basic user skills, you know the kind. The I am on the computer all day, so I'm basically already in IT, and no background in CS, and expected to have seen it all and get ready for the Bit League in a couple of months. I'm also from the DHTML days, like when the CGI module for Perl was the new hot thing, and sometimes I feel a bit insulted by that. Hear, hear. Not only were web apps of any kind a nightmare to write and maintain back then, but they were also much, much simpler in terms of business and user requirements. It's laughable to think anyone would even attempt to build modern apps without frameworks. Agreed. Whenever somebody says just use vanilla JS, I think two things. Once there's any complexity, you're going to hate yourself. Good luck reinventing a bunch of existing libraries. Something along this line should be a sticky post on this sub. Please remember, vanilla JS is not viable outside of simple websites, small personal projects, and tutorials. You don't have to npmi everything. You may also copy code fragments from OS projects and attribute it according to the license. If you don't use a framework, you're going to write a framework. If you don't use a framework, you're going to write a framework. This is especially true once you try to develop anything at scale. I like the simplicity of vanilla JS. Vanilla JS means no dependencies. Building a website with no dependencies is totally possible. Building an application with no dependencies is possible, but foolish. It is honestly not that complicated. I would say is much, much easier. It looks. You need to try more things to get used to them. Part of it is the nature of the beast. But another, very significant part is web developers themselves. They overcomplicate web dev. People used to call the bad ones hipster web devs, but now they're just called web devs. That's why a lot of experienced web devs tune out of the online conversation. It's not elitism or being a boomer who can't keep up. It's because once you truly get web dev and gain perspective, you can see it all as FOMO, pseudo-intellectualism, and shiny tools. Sorry, it's true. Front-end devs get bored and try to solve the entire software problem of the business with only front-end technologies. This is a dumb, but unfortunately very popular take. Front-end engineers aren't idiots and don't create complexity for no reason. If I said that about any other discipline, back-end, data, systems, DB, whatever, you'd call me an ass and move on, so stop being an ass. Look, bud, as a front-end dev, an SRE, I want to inform you that Bun just released a shell interpreter 2 days ago, and we need to be stopped because I will be writing everything in JavaScript from now on. I don't know if I totally agree. I'm on a team rebuilding someone's site using Angular, and I often find myself asking why. The old site has some issues, but it's absolutely fine. I feel like we are overcomplicating a lot of stuff needlessly. IDK, and somehow the client became aware of Ionic and also wants a mobile app that I can absolutely guarantee will not see much use. But if they want to sign our paychecks, though, I guess have fun with your app. Also, like 80% of their first, somehow most popular efforts aren't informed by a basic CS education. The web is a mess. That said, you can grab something like Solid or Svelte, which are more of a compiler that ship only minimal runtime to the browser and make building interactive UIs a lot smoother and just not pull in another 100 megabytes of libraries. Of course, that is built on the premise that you'll write your own code for things. And seeing the modern web dev, most just know how to throw a code React library at every problem they encounter, but this isn't unique to Frontend. I've had people wanting to pull in whole material UI libraries because they were tasked with implementing a simple table sorting or getting libraries with dozen transitive dependencies for what is a code status body equals status code status body json.stringify body. I think what lead to most of this on the front end is that the web has very bad primitives for what everyone wants it to be today, and that's likely not going to change anytime soon. But nowadays we at least have good options that try to be better at not creating an absolute clusterfuck. Vanilla.js is in a really good place, IMO. Look at this 15 lines of Vanilla.js doing a listing detail interaction. /jsfiddle.net /7jsfiddle.net 703x1. No fancy build needed and easy to SSR the HTML without fancy frameworks. This is like 90% of the interactivity needed on an e-commerce PDP. Select this variant, show this text and set of images. 10 years from now, this code is still going to work in whatever browser version we have at that time without ever having to patch or update dependencies. 10 years from now, this code is still going to work in whatever browser version we have at that time without ever having to patch or update dependencies. The same can be said for jQuery, though. It still works. I got burned making a styled drop-down component using an underlying HTML select in Vanilla.js because HTML forms work differently in different browsers after using the back button. You know that at the end of the day, even React, Svelte, and Vue are just rendering code, or worse, building some inaccessible code div tree? Whatever state you are expecting on a back navigation, it's not hard to ensure that it maintains the selection. And the same can be achieved in under 15 lines of JS and HTML combined in Svelte, even counting in the necessary code script tag, depending on how you write your code. But that's not the point. Take this small piece and put it together with everything else in a large project. Managing the DOM with Vanilla.js and keeping it in sync with your data will be a pain. And the same can be achieved in under 15 lines of JS and HTML combined in Svelte. There is no way that the ship.js will be 15 lines. It will be several kilobytes of code to support this basic, simple interaction and involve a build chain which includes multiple megabytes of dependencies. But you don't write the shipped code, you write Svelte. You also don't create a Svelte project to make one clickable list. You create a Svelte project to develop an interactive app where those few KB are either provided by Svelte or written by you, because you'll end up needing to do the same things Svelte already does. There's also Solid, if you're concerned, which produces an even smaller bundle, I believe. Still, it's not the point. The point is that now you have a self-contained reusable component with scoped styles, isolated behavior, and automatic UI updates that always reflect the state of your data. It's just so much easier to work with that in an app. You've missed the point entirely. You don't write the shipped code because you write in a meta layer that compiles into the shipped code. For such a simple interaction, you'll need a huge tool chain. You'll need to maintain and update dependencies for CVEs. Will the current version of Svelte work in 10 years? Will it work in 2? Or will you have to relink and update? This code in the example will probably work in browsers for at least the next 10 years without having to touch it.